All right, so obviously this is going to be economy stories whenever we talk about what's going on in the world in Mile a Minute. We'll try to put it into some perspective. But I guess lately there's been so much chat about how bad it is and the recession, and we don't know when it's going to end. The only question that anybody really cares about now, certainly people who have to deal with this like you every day, is what do we do? Like, all right, fine, so here's where we are. How do we fix it? Are things as bad as they seem? Well, we've got a guy who said it's not just a major crisis, but what it is that we're going through a major reset, which actually sounds kind of promising, except some places will suffer more than others, and it all depends on where you live. So right now in your community, do you look around and say, I think we'll all bounce out of this? Are we going to come out of this stronger? Well, maybe we won't based on where we live. And this guy says that we need to completely rethink our overall way of life. His ideas could shake up a lot of people. He's an economist, he's an urban theorist, and he's a best-selling author. You may know his books. So he had the Rise of the Creative Class and Who's Your City? Richard, Florida, in a moment. It'll be good to have him back on the show. First, we'll set it up. All right, so we all know that our economy is in pretty bad shape right now. You're hearing a lot of people focus on how do we fix the economy, but are they paying attention to how our economy is actually changing? Well, Richard Florida says that our economy is shifting away from the way it used to be. It used to be about manufacturing, right? And now it's moving towards idea-driven creative industries. Now, Richard says that stuff is happening in places like New York, Toronto, and even San Jose. There are these huge, diverse, integrated cities that are full of talented, ambitious, well-educated people who all arrive there from the rest of the country. Richard calls these people the creative class, those who can quickly come up with ideas and for a bunch of reasons, including the fact that they're all together, can turn them into products or services faster than people in other places. He says that will help those cities survive and even thrive. And we all know in cities built on manufacturing like Detroit and Windsor and St. Louis, they're having troubles. Richard says places like Phoenix and Las Vegas will also get hit hard as well because their booms were tied to the housing market, which is something that affects most people. The housing market tanks, we're in trouble. How do you turn things around from there? Well, Richard says, for one, forget owning a home. Real estate is too big a part of our economy. He says governments should encourage renting, not buying. That goes against everything your parents ever taught you. He also says we should invest more in the cities and regions that are already powering the economy so that they can compete in the years to come. Oh, by the way, he also says we should stop trying to save dying communities with bailouts or Band-Aid investments. Cue the revolt. Everybody, please welcome back to the Hour, Richard Florida. Good to see you, man. Good to see you. How are you? Great. How are you doing? Very well? You've got, you know, a new version of Who's Your City with all new Canadian content. And a new Canadian cover. And a new, I like this cover, actually. I do, too. I think they did a great job. They absolutely did. Okay, so you say this is not a crisis, it's a reset. Explain.
Well, you know, people talk about recession or depression, and my dad used to tell me all the time, he was born in the 20s, about the Great Depression.
Did he do it with that voice that, back in my day?
Exactly, and you know, we had holes in our shoes, and he used to tell me the same steam shovel got wrapped every Christmas, and you know, the whole thing. But I don't like the word depression. And not only is it kind of depressing, but it doesn't capture what we go through. Like, part of it is to reset not only our economy and our industries, but if we're going to get out of this thing, we're going to have to live differently. We're going to have to stop conspicuously consuming. We're going to have to stop buying these gigantic houses, and we're going to have to live a whole new way. That's what got us out of the Great Depression, actually. That's what's got us out of all our recessions. It's not just economic change. It's the change in the way we live.
The thing, though, is, and you know this, is people have enjoyed, certainly in the Western world, have enjoyed so much good in the last 20, 30, 40 years. Innovation, technology, quality of life, overstimulated with lots of toys that distract us from life. However, to take some of that back, that's tough. Taking candy from a kid's hard. Try taking my Wii.
Yeah.
You know?
No,
like,
you're absolutely right.
That's just a huge cultural rethink for us, isn't it?
But what we saw happen, especially back in the States where I'm from, a little bit less here, but certainly in Toronto where we're sitting, is this housing bubble made it so that people had to pay through the nose. If you look at Obama's plan, he's saying that people should pay 38% of their income for their house. Mm-hmm. Now you add in your utility bills, 2 cars, your clothes, your food. You're up to 60% of your income. How are you going to buy a Wii? How are you going to buy all of the fun stuff? So one of the things that we have to get through our heads is instead of making housing more expensive and cars more expensive, we've got to make housing less expensive. Put it this way. 100 years ago, we had to make food cheap so that we can grow industries like cars and TV sets and washers and dryers. Now we have to make housing and transportation and energy cheaper so we can consume all the cool stuff that we need to buy if we're going to grow our economy again.
You talk about renting, not buying, right? And then people have to stop buying.
But what do you guys think? I mean, it makes sense to me. How could you spend all that money to buy a house? I guess when you can flip them, you know, when it's a boom time, all these shows, you can flip them, it's fine. But as soon as you can't flip them, you're stuck. They call it underwater. They say now that 1 in 5 homeowners is underwater in their mortgage. Can you believe it? 1 in 5 of these people owe more than their house is worth. Well, and if you have to get a job, say you're in Windsor or Hamilton or Detroit or Cleveland, you got to get a new job because the economy is declining. If you're stuck with that house, how can you move? So what we're saying is if you rent, you could have more affordable housing, but if you need to, you can move.
Isn't it also that you have to spend 10 or 11 years paying off your mortgage before you pay more interest than principal? So in a sense, it's the cost of the house is a lot, but the interest you pay in the banks who make a fortune off the backs of you, that's the problem, is that you can't actually get ahead on a mortgage payment.
And it's a lot better, having had a mortgage in both places. Yeah. It's a whole lot better here, folks, than it is in the States. In the States, they had these things called interest-only mortgage. You paid no principal. No. You paid $1,000 or $2,000, or if you had a big one, $3,000 just in interest rate, and then you were stuck with the whole thing. My father used to tell me that they called them a balloon mortgage in the Depression. He said, Rich, these people pay for 3 or 5 years and they'd have nothing. They lost their house. That's sort of what we got back into in the past decade.
You know, stick around, because when we come back, I want to talk about your towns. You've got a complicated and controversial plan of let small towns die. We'll talk about that with Richard Florida when we come back.
Thanks, Ben. I think the really cool thing is we haven't blown our money. Our stimulus is relatively small. Our banks are still standing. Our economy is not nearly as hard hit in the States. If we play it cool and we stay calm and we begin to think about these things, we can make investments that will make our way of life for our cities and our regions and for the country much better.
We're back here talking to Richard Florida. So right now we're in the era of the bailout, right? Whatever industry is collapsing, let's throw some money at it and try to save them, save communities, save people jobs. But your version of economic Darwinism doesn't really cover for that.
Well, stop the madness. I mean, here it's okay. The bailout's small. In the States, it's trillions of dollars. And what are they doing? They're bailing out an old economy. They're bailing out the housing system. They're bailing out the banking system. They're bailing out car makers that lost tens of billions of dollars. And I don't say that because I'm like an economic conservative. Actually, I'm just the opposite. I think people and communities could use that money a lot. They need it more, and they could use it a lot more wisely.
What happens when towns like Windsor or Hamilton or the West or even the East Coast of this country, where industries that were working, manufacturer-based industries, no longer work? What do you do to those communities?
Stop bailing out the old industries that mismanage themselves and let the communities rebuild. Take Detroit. My wife's from Detroit. The GM and Ford and Chrysler mismanaged their business, but think about the most innovative musical scene in history. Not just Motown, but Iggy Pop, the MC5, electronic, techno.
The White Stripes.
The White Stripes, and on and on and on. Why not invest in building that music scene, invest around the young designers, and create some new industries instead of bailing out these? And in fact, they were the squelchers. Those old school industries are the squelchers that held the communities back because they didn't release the people's creative energy.
Well, I guess the idea is jobs, though, right? And that GM will employ far more people than the White Stripes. Well, there are only 2 of them. So how...
No, but when they make the movies in Detroit or when they build the music scene, it's not just the White Stripes. Yeah. It's all the people who run the cameras, who work in the studios, the engineers. Nashville. Think about Nashville, Tennessee, this little backwater town, has built a modern economy around, and guess where Jack White moved?
That's right.
He moved from Detroit to Nashville because he saw that, what they call infrastructure, all that music stuff. So yeah, you can do it, and you can actually create vibrant industries and reemploy people if you build in that way.
Great idea. Doesn't seem like in any way, shape, or form that would happen. Do you look at this theory and say this is a great theory that will never be, or do you see windows of hope?
I think it will happen. You know, 100 years ago, people would have said, how are we going to survive if our farm goes broke? More than 50% of North Americans, 60% of North Americans, Canadians and Americans, worked on farms. Now 2% of us work on farms. We form new jobs in these industries, in auto companies and electronics companies. Of course we're going to find new and creative things to do and more human things to do. So I think it'll happen. It's just that our politicians are a little bit behind the curve.
Mm-hmm. Well, because they just need to get elected, right?
Yeah, and what they see is they see those blocks of voters as being the thing that will elect them. But I think over this crisis, this reset, we're going to see people change the way they think. And as younger people come up, you know, less and less young people are involved in these heavy industries, they're going to bring new demands.
Something I found interesting, you were writing an article for Atlantic Monthly, you had stuff that went in there, and you've talked about it here, is just changing the actual physical structure of a city. High-speed rail and what that can do, even from a region like, if you put a high-speed rail from Montreal to Detroit, and how that changes.
Right through Toronto.
Right through Toronto,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, just the way after the Great Depression, the way we really grew the economy in Canada and America wasn't the New Deal, and it wasn't even the World War II effort. That helped. It was suburbanization. Yeah. People could buy the house. They had to buy the car. My parents had a Kelvinator refrigerator, a Maytag wash, or a Magnavox stereo.
And the interstates, right? The interstates are connected it all.
And it made the city bigger. You could put business and people. Now we have to make the whole thing much bigger. We were just talking about this, you and me. If you could take that fast train, you could make Windsor, certainly London, all the way over to Ottawa, commuter suburbs of Toronto. And you know where you see it working? Where I used to live in Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. is now, in effect, a suburb of New York City. People commute on that fast, high-speed rail line all the time. Same thing with Boston. 50 million people, $2 trillion in economics. We're even better off here in Canada because our regions are all, they're aligned along the border. They're really easy to connect. You could bring economic growth and vibrancy to some of our declining towns just by connecting with a fast rail.
Well, these high-speed rails, you can go from Montreal to Toronto in 2 hours. People can live there.
Yeah, you can commute, and you can make it cheap. And plus, you could work. You're not sitting in your car trying to look at your BlackBerry and not kill yourself. You could work on the train.
Well, and on the West Coast, you've got that, was it the Pacific Cascade?
Yeah, I call it Cascadia.
Yeah. Which is what, Seattle instead of Portland?
Portland, Seattle, and Vancouver. And what's so cool about that is companies have been moving to Vancouver because it's such an open-minded place and it's beautiful. They can attract workers from all over the world, not just Vancouver people. They attract workers from all over the world. Imagine you could run that fast rail. They're talking about a fast rail. Did you hear about it from Las Vegas to Disneyland? Yeah, I guess that's fun for fun and games.
Sure.
But you could make that whole Cascade
area. There's 25 people who go to Vegas now, right? Like no one goes now.
Yeah.
But that just shows how back-asswards these people are. And how do we here get our politicians, like Dalton McGuinty in Ontario, Gordon out in British Columbia, they talk a big game about how this is important to them. How do you articulate to them that this is the kind of big thinking we need and with a significant expenditure?
I'll tell you one thing, and the Premier asked us to do this report for me and this guy, Roger Martin, a guy, Dean at the University of Toronto. We did it. He listened. His minister, Mike Bryant, they care about this. They have political constraints. They have a lot of different constituencies. It's a tough time. They have to do things. Right. The mayor here, he's willing to at least talk about these things. Mayor Miller, in a way, and actually, Ronna and I, my wife, have been traveling all across Canada, engaging communities. So I think the really cool thing is we haven't blown our money. Our stimulus is relatively small. Our banks are still standing. Our economy is not nearly as hard hit in the States. If we play it cool and we stay calm and we begin to think about these things, we can make investments that will make our way of life for our cities and our regions and for the country much better. And I think, Toronto and Vancouver, Montreal, Ottawa, Canada has to lead. The United States, I'm American. It's on its back. We go visit Detroit. We go to Pittsburgh, even New York. You said Las Vegas. Miami Beach is dead.
Yeah.
Canada now has an opportunity in North America to really lead. And I don't think it's Gordon Brown. Going back to it's not Gordon Brown who's going to lead. I think Canada and our communities really have a chance to show the world a new way.
Isn't San Jose doing this? Isn't like there's certain parts of America like that is actually becoming very progressive?
Yeah, well, I think there's, we know this, George. There's two Americas. There's a very progressive kind of San Francisco Bay Area, New York metropolitan area, Washington, D.C., and then they call them the flyover states. The stuff in the middle that people really don't get it. But I think there's parts of the...
Also known as people. The civilians and the citizens, right?
Yeah.
But that's the country.
Well, Obama, in one of his more lucid moments, actually said the problem, people feel like they're being left behind. Yeah. They're scared. I think in Canada, people, because we have a social welfare system and everybody has health care, and people aren't as scared. I feel it, folks. I feel it on the streets. People don't feel terrified. When I go home to the States, I feel that fear. Now, my dad always told me, the U.S. has an incredible capacity to turn itself around.
Yeah, they're great comebacks.
It's a fantastic place. But I think now, actually, because we're so much wealthier than we were 30, 40 years ago, and our great cities have become centers of we're the most diverse cities in the world, Toronto and Vancouver. I think and Montreal with the music. Oh, my, all the great bands, not only coming out of here, coming out of Montreal. I think we got a fantastic opportunity to kind of be a little bit less humble and be a little bit more aggressive and show the world that we can do it. That's why we moved here.
When are you going to run for politics?
Never. I'm having too much fun, man. I like hanging out with you.
He's got a couple of best-selling books, The Rise of the Creative Class, plus Who's Your City, which is, as we showed you, a special Canadian edition. It's good to see you, man.
Thank you. It's great to be back.
Richard, Florida, everybody. All right, when we come back, we'll start with a huge new film called Watchmen.